And finally, the project I promised from the beginning of the course. Let's build a MVC framework. If I had started to build the MVC framework without any introduction, you'd think, oh, this is so hard, I don't understand, it's useless, and so on. But now, when I talk about what MVC is and how it works, you'd be surprised how simple and powerful it is. What you need to know in order to understand and build a simple MVC code are these 4 topics. Object-oriented programming like classes, inheritance, and etc. How to build a router and how to work with .htaccess file. Then database, and finally composer and dependency management. And you already know all of this. If you want to review any of them, you can check out the course till now and watch the videos again. So let's get started. First of all, what is MVC? MVC, which is short for Model View Controller, is a software architectural pattern. What does it mean? Well, you can literally build your whole code in one index.php file and it works without any problems. But it's not clean and it's not maintainable and it's not scalable. So you need a structure to help you make it easier to implement, easier to scale, and easier to maintain. Have you ever built a static website with HTML and CSS? You can put all the HTML files and all the CSS files and all the images and all the JS files in one folder without any problem, and your website will still work. But it's very messy. So you would put them in different folders. You put images in one folder, you put CSS in one folder, you put JS files in another folder, and so on. MVC is exactly like that. It tells us to divide our code in different sections, mainly model, view, and controller. So what are they? Model is a thing that contains the data. View is the component that displays those data. And controller is responsible for connecting the two, meaning it gets the data from the model and prepares them and gives them to view to display. That's it. That's the whole structure. Laravel, which is the most popular PHP framework, is using this simple architecture in its core. So now let's build our own MVC. First of all, we need to create the folder structures. So let's create them. New folder model, new folder view, and new folder controller. I also like to create one called public for styles and images and all the other stuff. Public. And I also like to add one other directory called app, which holds the files like my helper codes and initialization files. It doesn't have anything to do with the model, view, and controller. It's more related to the core of the code and how I want to clean my code. So it completely is depending on my decision. That's all the folder we need for now. We can organize everything in these folders, but during the coding we might decide, oh, it's better to add another folder for routes, for example, or let's create another directory for config files. That's just our decision. Now, the very first thing that we want to do is to redirect all the requests to one file with the help of .htaccess file. I'm going to put it in my public folder. Why? Because I'm going to run my PHP server from here, and this would be like my root folder in the server. So inside the public folder, I want to create .htaccess file, and we should write in this .htaccess file. Exactly. First, we rewrite engine on, then rewrite base is to the root folder here because we are going to run in public. We are going to leave it as is and rewrite conditions, and we want to rewrite everything to index.php file. Where is this index.php file? Again, inside public folder. So let me create that, index.php. And now I can write my code in index.php file. As I said, we can create our whole project in an index.php file and it would work, but it wouldn't be maintainable and scalable. In our case here, I am redirecting everything to index.php. But in fact, I don't want to, and I'm not going to write a lot of code in my public folder. I want my code to be in the other folders that I have built. So all I need to do here is just require the init file and then initialize the project and all the necessary codes there. So let's do it. All I need to do here is to just require once app init.php. We don't have it yet, so let's go and create it. Inside the app, I'm going to create a new file called init.php, which I'm going to use to initialize all the files and require everything necessary. So let's echo something to see if everything is working. Echo I am in init file. Perfect. As I mentioned, I want to run my code with PHP server rather than XAMPP. So I can run something like PHP capital S local host and then the port, which in my case I would like to use port 8000. But before we run this command, where is our .htaccess file? It's in public folder, so we have to go there. That's the root of our project. So we'll go to cd public and then we will run the code to start PHP's local server. Localhost port 8000. Okay, perfect. Now let's go to localhost to see if it has worked. Localhost port 8000. What was that? Localhost port 8000. And perfect. I am in init file. Let's go back to our code. Let's review what is happening right now. We have an index.php file in the public folder, and we are in the public folder when we run our local server. This is the root directory of our server now. Have you seen that public HTML folder in your cPanel when you get a new hosting? This is exactly like that. We are telling our server to redirect everything to this index.php file. That's for having pretty URLs. Do you remember when we were building a router and we talked about pretty URLs? That's it. That's just to make sure instead of going to contact.php, service.php, etc., we would go to service or contact. And instead of having all those x.php files to manage everything, we have index.php to manage all of those requests. And now in our index.php file, we require the init file, which is in our app folder. This init file is just to initialize everything we need for our MVC structure to work. And we haven't written anything yet. We just echoed to make sure everything is working and we are in the right folder. Till now, that's all we did. This init file is just based on our decision. I could write all the initialization code in the same index.php file and it would still work. Now let's see what we need to do. First of all, I need a way to manage the routes. So which route should use which controller? For that, we need a router. We have already built a router. Do you remember that project? So let's use the code from that. Let me copy the codes. Let's create a file called router.php, and let me paste everything here. Okay. It was a class called router, which had one handle function, which would get the method and the path, and it would include a file name. At the moment, I am putting the router in the app folder because I'm going to put everything that has anything with the core, like helpers and stuff like that. But maybe later I created another folder called core and put everything there. But for now, let me put it here. So first let's test it. Let me use that in my init file. Require once the router Now let me use it. Router, for example, get. It would pass the path like test, and here I can require a file, or I can pass an anonymous function or a predefined function. So let me write something like function echo I am here. Let me pass that there. So now I expect my router to work, and when I go to test, it would echo it here. Otherwise, it shouldn't echo anything. Let me go to the browser. If I am in the home folder, I don't expect it to print anything, echo anything. And when I go to test, I am here. It echoes I am here. So everything is working properly, and I have copied the code correctly. Now let's see. I want to change some stuff in my router. As I said, at the moment it is requiring a file or an anonymous function or a predefined function. When we come here and it requires a file, what that file usually do? It gets the data from file, from another class, from database, etc. It works on them and it echoes the data and shows them to the user. So that's exactly what a controller does. So let's change it a bit. So instead of a file, it would require a controller. Let's change the variable name from file name to controller in all of the methods. Controller, so it would be more readable. Let's change the require. So it would require the same controller from controller folder and add .php at the end by default. So we wouldn't have to write xcontrol.php every time. So I would like it to require everything from controller folder. Inside the controller, I would have a controller. Then that controller would also be a PHP file. So I will add the .php here. So let's create a controller and see if it works in init file. I want to check router get. If it's test, I want to use test controller. Let me use test controller. So let me create that file inside the controller, new file, test controller.php, and inside this echo I am in the controller. So let's go to the browser again to see if it works. We are in test. I am in the controller. Perfect. Let's go back to our code. Now here we should make a decision. What's that decision? In a real scenario, this wouldn't be a test controller. This would be a controller that is going to get some model, do something, and show some view to the user. How should I organize my controllers? See, when we are developing a MVC, it's not just about programming. It's about software design and engineering. In terms of coding, I can literally do anything I want in the controllers. But in terms of design and engineering, I need to understand the architecture and decide how I'm going to organize these controllers. So let's see what would user do in real life and see what choices we have. For example, let's think about a product. User wants to list those products. User wants to see the details of one product. User wants to update that product, and user wants to delete that product. Should we have controllers for each one like this? Product list controller, and then have something like product detail controller, and then have another one for update, and then another one for delete. Should I do this? If yes, Should I have all of these different files in the main controller folder, or should I create a new folder called product, and then inside it I could have all my controllers that are related to this product? And then since I'm putting it all in a folder called product, I could remove that from the name of the controller, and it would be list controller, detail controller, update controller, and so on. So it would be like product and then list controller, something like this. Or should I have all of them in the same file, like product controller, and then create different methods inside that, like product controller and then list, or details, and so on. So this is our decision as software designers, but this decision is something that a lot of software engineers had to make already, so we can learn from them by studying their work. For example, Laravel takes the third approach. For each controller, we have a class like product controller. Inside that class, we have a method like index, update, etc. And then inside that method, we do the necessary things. And Laravel is the most popular PHP framework. So it's a decision that has worked for a lot of projects, and we can use the same approach. So for each of our controllers, we will have a xcontroller.php file, which would be a class, and inside that class, we will have different methods. So I'm going to do that, but let me show you something. Right now, if we change the test controller, which is simply echo something, to a class like test controller, class test controller, and we have a method like public function show. Let's see what happens. Let me put that echo there. Inside the init file, let me clean this part out. Let me go to the browser again, and let me refresh the page. What happens? Nothing. Do you know why? Let me go back to the code. The router is requiring the controller, but the controller is a class now, and it needs to be instantiated. So let's instantiate it after the require. Here we say controller equals to new controller. Now we have an object. Now what happens? Let me go back to my browser and refresh the page. What happens? Again, nothing, because we don't know which method of this controller should be called. So let's add that to our router as well. Let me go back to our code. Here I need to run one of the methods in that controller. How can I know which one I should run? We can add an argument here called action, which is by default null. When we get to here, we need to call that method. This action is null by default, because if we pass anonymous functions, by default there wouldn't be a need to this action. But if we pass a controller, we would need to know this action, the method that should be called. Let's pass show in our init file for the router of tests. Init, here I want to pass show. So now here it would go to test controller. This router would require it, then instantiate it, and then calls the action, which is show. Now let's go back to our browser and see if something happens. Let me refresh the page, and it gives me an error. Method name must be a string. Router line 20. Let's go back to the code to see why we got the error. At the moment, when we go to init file, we run get test controller and then the action. we have added the action to the handle method, but not all the other methods. And here we are using get. That's why our action wasn't passed. So let me pass that action to all of these methods. And all of these methods, when they call handle, they will pass this action as well. So let me add that as well. And okay. Now when we run get test controller and action, this action will be passed to the handle function as well, and I expect the problem to be solved. Let's go back to browser. Let's refresh the page. Perfect. I am in controller. So let's review the code again. Right now init is telling if it's the path of test, go to test controller and run show. In our router we have added this action and we set it to null by default. We come here, we require the controller, we instantiate it, and then we call that method which was passed there. And in our controller, which is a class now, we have that method, and inside that method we are echoing I am in the controller. Perfect. Now based on the product example that I have mentioned, with this structure, with this router, if we wanted to create a RESTful API, we would have these methods. We would have a router called products, and for products we would have product controller, and it would go to index function. Then we have products, for example an ID, it can be something here, and product controller again we would have show, then product ID edit, we would have edit. For update we would pass put, and we would update here. If we wanted to store something, we would call post to that product controller, and we have store or save or insert. And then if we wanted to delete it, we simply call the delete and product controller delete. All these paths will be managed in one file called product controller, which would be a class, and inside that class we would have all these methods, and these methods would handle the request and would require a view and then show the data to the user. You see how easy and how maintainable and how scalable this simple code that we have written till now will become. Imagine if you wanted to do all of these in just one index.php file, or if you wanted to create a new file for each route. It would get messy very soon. So till now, our structure would work and it would be perfect. Just one last thing before we go to the next part. Do you see that ID that I have added here? We might have different products with different IDs. So we wouldn't have to come here and write, okay, product 1, product 12, product 13 or something. Based on our current router, which comes here and tries to match the pattern, we can use regex patterns here. So here I would say I expect this to be a number from 0 to 9 with a star, and it would work. Let me do that for my test controller so you would see the power of our simple router and how many routes and files it would save us. Let me show that in our test controller so you would see how powerful it is. So let me go back to my browser right now. If I go to 1, 100, 1000, 500, all of them would go to the same file. Later we can create the logic and the necessary code to extract this ID and get the data from database based on this ID. With just 6 routes and a simple router, we we could create a RESTful API for our products. This is how powerful it is. Now let's go back to our code. Let's see what we want to do with our controller and let's work on that. Okay, now let's work on the controller. This controller is going to get the model which represent the data and then show them in the view. So let's first work on the view. View is just another file that we are going to require and pass some data to it. So let's say, for example, we have a name variable which holds the value AMIR. We want to require another file and pass the variable to it so it can display those data to the user. So let's make it a method of controller. It would be a private function called view. This view needs a file name, which by default is empty, and some data, which again by default is an empty array. Then it requires that file, require once. That file is in our view folder. So we are going to require that, and then we pass the file name here. And then since that file name is going to be .php as well, we will add the .php. I don't like to add .php in all my views. Like I don't want to say require x.php, y.php. Just write x and y, and here we will add .php. And since we are passing the data through this function, it will automatically load this data, and this file will have access to this data as well. So let's test it. Here, instead of echoing something here, I want to run this view, and the file name, let's say it's just test, and the data would be name. The name would be AMIR. Now let's create that view, and inside our view directory I'm going to create a file, test.php. So now from this controller we expect a test, so it would go to view test.php, which we have just created. Here we are going to do something. We are going to say echo hello, and then plus the data we had. Here we passed all the data in the variable data, so inside this it will be available as data, and then we had name, as you can see here, name AMIR. So I expect this to echo hello AMIR. Let's go back to our browser and see if it works. Let me refresh the page, and yes, hello AMIR, it works perfect. Let's go back to our code. At the moment, this view method it's only available in test controller. So every time we create a new controller, we have to do it manually and add this method to it manually. So product controller, user controller, and any other controller that we add would need this view function, but it doesn't have that, so we have to add it manually. What we can do to clean it up a bit, we can create a base controller that this test controller would extend, and then put this method there, so all of our controllers would have access to it. Do you remember when we talked about inheritance? This is exactly that. And since this base controller would be part of our core, I would add it to app. I'm going to create a new PHP class called controller, and this controller, let me copy all these view method to this controller. This controller would have this private function called view, which would get the file name and the data, and it would require the file, and the data would automatically be available to it. So in the test controller, all I have to do is just to extend that controller. First we need to require it, so our code would know where would that class be. It's in the app folder and it's called controller.php. Now here we can say this test controller should extend that controller. Now we will have access to this view function, but there is a problem, and as you can see, our IDE has also drawn a red line here. Why? Because in our controller we made it private. We should change it to protected or public so the children could access it. So here when we come back to our test controller, now the red line is gone because now it's protected, and this test controller as a child of this controller would have access to this view. So let's go back to our browser and run the code again to see if we broke anything. Perfect, it works without any problem. And now when I create a new controller like product controller, user controller, or anything else, all I have to do is just to extend that base controller that we built, and it will automatically have access to this view method. So let's review what is happening in our application. At the moment, we are running the local server from this public.php file. And because of this HD access file, everything is being redirected to this index.php. Then this index.php is requiring the init file. And inside the init file, we are requiring the router in order to be able to add our routes to our project. At the moment, I am adding all these routes here in the init file, and it's no problem, but we can create another file called, I don't know, routes.php, and then add all these routes there, and here we just require that file. But for now, this would work and there is no problem. Then we have this router and we specify different path, and we specify the controller and the action and the method of that controller that we want to use. Here we are saying I want to use test controller show. I want to use post product controller index method, and based on our decision we decided that instead of having like product list controller, product detail controller, product show controller, we would have one controller, and inside that controller we would have different methods. So here we are saying if I went to test and after that there was any number which would represent like the ID of our data, I would like to go to test controller and I would like to run the show method. Our router then comes say, okay, we are in the test and we are going to require that controller, and then create a new instance of it and then run that action, run that method of that controller. Inside that test controller that we required, we have a method called show. This show will then run the view method, which is part of this controller that is the parent of our test controller right now, because we have inherited it with this extend keyword. And then this would require a new view file which is in our view directory, and inside that view, which was test.php, we are getting access to all those data and we are displaying them to the user. Now that our view is working, let's talk about model. Well, what is the model? Model is data, and in most of our application, the data is stored in database. So our database is kind of like our model layer, but we want to have a representation of those data as classes in our MVC. So each model is a class that represents the data in database, most of the time, not always. So let's see. I already have a database called MVC, and inside that MVC database, I have a table called students, and students have ID, name, and surname, and age. Now let's go back to our code and create the necessary class. First of all, let me close all the unnecessary files. I need the test controller. Okay. And here let's create a new class inside our model directory called student. This student is going to be a representation of that student table. So this should be able to get all the students. This should be able to get one student. This should be able to insert data. This should be able to update data, and this should be able to delete the data from database. And all of our models would have all these functionalities, because if I have another table called product, then the product model should be able to do all of this. If I have another model called, I don't know, user, then user model should be able to do all of this. It should be able to access database and do all of these queries and updates and inserts. So let's do the same thing that we did for controllers. We created a base controller that would have the functionalities that all the controllers require, and all of our controllers would extend that base controller. So let's create the same thing for models. Let's create a new class called model inside our app directory. This model would have all the necessary methods that all the models would have. So then we would come and we just say extends model, and this model comes from require once app model.php. Okay, first of all, this model needs to get connected to database. So we can have a function, private function, because it doesn't need to be accessed from outside. Private function connect to DB, and then this would get connected to our DB, and then we would have a private PDO which we are going to store the connection, and then we would have different methods for each action. We can say, for example, we would have a public function, because all of the models are going to get access to it. Public function get all, and then we would have another function which only gets one, and it would get it based on the ID. Then we would have store, which we would get some data, and we use this data to store them in the database. And then we would have another method for update. This update would also get the data, but it would also get the ID, because we are going to update that ID based on those data. And finally, it would have a public function delete to delete the ID that we pass. Okay, these are the functions that all of our models would need. But now there are two issues. First of all, each model would have a different table name. So we need to have that inside the model, and then use these parents to be able to access to those tables. So here I could add a protected variable called table, which by default is an empty string. And then when I create a new model, I would come here and overwrite that protected table. Here would be students. This is the beauty of object-oriented programming. Now I have access to all those methods in my model, which I should change the O to lowercase. And I would also be able to overwrite some of the data that is written in the parent. So here I'm overwriting the table value. And the second problem is that if we do this right now, each model is going to get connected to the database. But in our controller, we might require like 10 different models. So each time, if each model gets connected to database at the end of the request lifecycle, we would have 10 different open connections to the database. In order to avoid that, we can create the connection in the controller on the controller side. Then this controller would pass this connection to each of these models, so they do not need to create a new connection every time. They can use the connection that is already there, that is already open, and use that. So what can we do? When we come here and we want to say I want to require the students model student, and I want to have a new instance of it, for example student equals to new student. Here I want to pass my database connection, so in my student class and in my model, which is the parent, it wouldn't create a new database connection. So here, instead of connect to DB, I can use the public function construct, which is the very first method that each class runs after getting instantiated. And this construct method would require a PDO object, PDO, and this PDO variable that we created would become this PDO. So now later when we are using this PDO, which is reference to this, it's actually a already open connection. That way, if I have like 10 new instances of this student, it wouldn't create 10 new connection to the database. So now that we have added that there, here I have to pass the PDO object. So how can I do that? I should have something in order to pass it, and as you can see right now my ID says I don't have this PDO object. What are you talking about? So let's get connected to the database in my controller rather than the model. So here I would have public function construct. So every time a new controller is created, we are going to run this construct method as the first method that would be run. And here we would be saying, okay, I have a PDO which I want to create, PDO. And then this would be MySQL, and the host name would be localhost. But all of this data we can add as a config file later, and we would just pass them here instead of just hard coding all those data here. Localhost, and then the DB name is MVC, and what's the user? The user is root, and it doesn't have any password. Okay, this is going to get connected to the MVC database that we had, and now somehow we are going to pass this to this student. We can add a new private variable here, and then this PDO would be created here. And then later when we want to pass the PDO to student, we can just say this PDO. Now when in our router we run new controller, it's going to come to this test controller and get connected to database, and then go to show function, and inside the show function is going to pass that database to a student, and a student is going to use that and do some queries here that we are going to build right now, and then pass those data to the view, and the view would display them. So let's do it. Let's add those queries to our model to see how it would work. First of all, let's start with getAll method. We want to select everything from a specific table. So a statement would be this PDO query select everything from which table? This table. And this table is going to be different for each model because we are overwriting them. Students, in our case, is going to say this PDO query select everything from students, and models would be stm fetch all. And how I want to fetch my data? I want them to be objects. So I would say fetch object. Okay. And then I'm going to return these models. So let's test our very first method to see if everything has been done correctly and everything is working. So in my test controller, I'm getting connected to database. I'm creating a new student, and from this student, I'm going to run get all, and I expect to get all the students, and I want to var dump them. Students equals to this. So let's see if it works. But before we run the code, let's first add some data to our database. Now I have added some data to my table, AMIR KAMIZI age 28, John Doe age 25, and I expect all of them to be returned with my getAll function. So let's go back to the code. Let's review it. I'm getting student all, and I'm going to var dump them. Okay, so let's go back to our browser. Let's go and run the code. Perfect. Objects are returned. Name AMIR, surname KAMIZI age 28, and the second object is name John and the age is 25. The surname is Doe. Perfect. Everything is working right now. So let's go back to our code and clean it up a bit. At the moment, I am getting connected to database from my controller, from this test controller. We are going to solve the exact same problem that we had with view. For each new controller, I have to add this method manually, but we are going to have this method for all of our controllers. So let's add it to our parent. Exactly. Let's go back to the base controller and add this method there as well. It would be a function construct, and the construct would get this PDO, and this PDO comes here, and instead of private it should be protected, so all the other methods would be able to use that. And the construct function is by default a public function. So let me remove them from here and here, and let's see if everything is still working. Let's go back to the browser. Let's run the code again, and perfect, everything is working. Let's go back to the code. Let's see what else we can do. In the model, we only created the getAll, but let's see if we can add other methods as well. For example, let's say I only want to get one of them. So we are getting statement equals to this PDO query, but instead of query, because this ID is coming from outside, from the URL, from user, this is not safe. So I'm going to prepared select everything from this table where ID equals to question mark, and then we bind that value. We say stm bind value, and the first one is the ID. If you want to review your knowledge about database connection with PHP, you can watch the video I have for databases. In there, I also explain why we are using prepare statement rather than just querying them. Then we need to execute that. Prepare the statement, execute. Okay, perfect. And now our model would be this stm fetch. And again, how I'm going to fetch it? I'm going to fetch it as object. Okay. And let's return that model. Perfect. So I'm getting an ID. I'm preparing a statement. Select this table. Select everything from this table where ID equals to this ID. We then bind the value and then execute it, and we return it as a model. So here in my controller, if instead of get all, I say get and the ID 1, let's war dump the value to see what we'll get. Let's go to our browser. Okay, perfect. I'm only getting the first one. ID was 1, name is AMIR, surname is KAMIZI, and age is 28. Perfect. Let's go back to our code. Let's add one more function, because this function would be a little bit harder than the other ones, because we are going to create a generic one. It would be easy to write the SQL to insert data to database when we know the column, when we know the values. But because here our method is generic and we are going to use it for all the models. So one model might have 10 columns, one model might have 2 columns, and we don't know the name of the columns. So all of them are going to be passed as data. So let's try to write the SQL statement, try to write the function for it and see how it works. First of all, for inserting the data, again, we need to prepare a statement because all the data are coming from outside, from the user, from URS query parameters. So it's not safe at all. So we have to use prepare statement, and then we are going to bind some values and we are going to execute. Because it's this insert statement, it's not going to return anything. But how we are going to manage binding values and columns? So let's see. First of all, we need to write insert into this table. Then here we would pass normally the column names, but here how can I know the column names? In the data we pass, we expect the data to be an array. So this array would have something like name equals to something, surname equals to something. So the column names would be the keys. So we can extract that as our data. But how can we do that? We can get the array keys by running the function array keys of that data. This would return another array. So, but here I cannot pass just a PHP array into my SQL statement. I have to change it and make it a string of values that are separated by comma. So I can implode everything with the separator of comma and get all the key names like this. You see what is happening here? We are getting the keys from the data that is passed. Data is an array which has the column name as key and the value would be the value. We would have them as an array, and then we are connecting all those data with a comma, and we can now add that here. Perfect. Now the rest of our insert SQL statement would be values, and we are supposed to pass values here, but because we are going to prepare a statement, we are going to pass question marks here. Because it's generic, I don't know the number of columns each table might have. So again, we are going to get that from the data. Data is an array. So if we count that, it would tell us that, okay, I have this many values, and for those many values we can add question marks here. But instead of writing a for each loop to add for each item add a question mark there is another function in PHP called array fill, which creates a new array and fills this array with the value that we specify. So in our case, I want the start index to be 0, and I want to add this many question marks. So now this array fill starts a new array that starts from index 0, and the size of this array will be the number of data we have here, and for each of them it would add question mark as a value. So the final would be something like this. If we had like 3 values, it would add 3 question marks and return an array with 3 question marks. So now that I have all these question marks, I need to again change them to comma separated values. So I can use implode again, implode comma, and then all these data that would be returned here. And now as a result of this, I would be having something like this, the number of question marks based on my array. So my values would also be okay, values, okay, we have implode array fill, and now we have a statement that says like insert into, I don't know, students, and then it would have like name, surname, age, and values would be this. This would be the statement that we are passing here with all these implodes and array keys. Now we are going to bind that. How can we bind those values? We are going to write a for each loop. For each data as key value, we need the value. We are going to stm bind a number here and then the value. When we bind the value, as you can see here, we are going to say which parameters, which value I'm going to bind. So here we pass 1, 2, 3, 4, and it starts from 1. It's not like array that starts from 0. So here I can have some form of counter that starts from 1, like I equals to 1, and after each iteration I would add one value to it. So for the first iteration it would say, okay, bind 1 name, then we add 1 to it, and it would be bind 2 surname, bind 3 age, and then it finishes and comes here and execute that. So let's see if it works. Let's go back to our controller. Here let's say store, and the data, as I said, is going to be an array, and this array is going to have like name equals to Mary, surname is going to be Jane, and age is going to be 26. Now this students goes there is no return value, so we don't need to store that in a variable. It comes here, it says name Mary, surname Jane, age 28, store it. We come to the model, it say okay, add the keys here, add the values there, bind the value and execute it. Let's go back to our controller. Let me go to the browser and refresh the page, and then go to the database to see if it has been added. Call to undefined method PDF statement bind. Oh, let's go back to the code. If I go to model, I just wrote bind. It's bind value. It's my mistake. Let's go back to the browser, refresh the page. Perfect, no error. Let's go to our database, refresh it. Perfect, Mary Jane 26 has been added. Perfect. The store function is also working now. Let me go back to the code and clean it up a bit. Let's review everything till now to see which parts can be adjusted a bit. We are going to index. We are requiring the init Let me clean this part out a bit. I don't need all of these explanations. I don't need this here. We require the router, which is a class that helps us decide which file to show, which controller to show. We can have controller or we can have anonymous and predefined functions. And then we define our routes. Again, as I said, we can define our routes in another file, but for now we are going to define them in the init file. Since this part is a regex, we can use regex functionality as well, but for now let's remove that. Test controller show, and here the router requires that controller from controller folder test controller.php and creates a new instance of it and runs the method that we have specified, which was show. It comes to test controller extends another controller. What does other controller do? The other controller has two methods. One is a construct. Let me bring it up because construct is the first function. Construct, and then it creates a connection to database, and it also has a protected function view, which will return a view to display the data to the user. Then in our test controller, we create a new model instance. This model student is, let me open it. This model students, it has a protected value table, which is different for each model. But all the functionalities, well, most of the functionalities are actually in its parent, which is the model. And if we go to model, we see that it gets the database connection because we didn't want to open a new connection. And it has different methods like get all, get, store, and update and delete. It also have a table which is actually being overridden by this protected table inside the student class. Then we run whatever we want here, and then we pass the data to view, and this view is going to be in our view folder. This is actually a function that would look for that view in the view folder and as a .php file. Then we can pass some data here. Let me use AMIR, for example, equals to a student get 1. I can pass that here. AMIR would be AMIR, and inside my view, which was test view, I would get access to that AMIR. Since this is another PHP file, I can create a variable AMIR equals to data AMIR, and then here I can get it. Since it was object, I can get the name and expect it to show the name here. Let me go back to the browser, remove the ID part, let's test, and it says hello AMIR. Perfect. Let's go back to the code. Our controller would have this method. We can have different methods here, for example show, store, delete, and something else. So we have the model functionality, we have the controller functionality, we have the view functionality, and we have a router, so we have pretty URLs as well, and we have the core functionalities and parents in here, but we can add them to another folder, I don't know, core, something like that. This is the end of this lesson. We have created a simple MVC, and now if you look at a framework like Laravel, you know the core structure of it, you'd understand it better. Laravel is the result of years of code improvement and thousands of contributors, but it started from the same core functionalities. This is not just the end of this lesson, but this is the end of the course as well. I have one more lesson for you before we finish the course, and that's learning how to find answers, how to trust yourself enough to change the code in a systematic way without breaking anything. And to learn that, I want you to add more functionalities to this MVC that we built. I will not give you the answers, so it's just you on your own. You should try to improve it and finalize this MVC code. Some of the ideas that I had that you could add to this and improve it, it's like finish adding update and delete method to our model class, add namespace to the classes, and move the routes definition to another file so we wouldn't have to touch init too much. Use autoload instead of using require everywhere, and write tests. And you can refactor the codes to make it cleaner. And that's it. It was a pleasure teaching you about PHP from beginner to advanced. Enjoy coding and have a wonderful day.